We have a great program in store for this one because our friend Tim Brown drops by the Pigpen to get us ready to watch some CFL football that's hopefully starting soon, and also shares the rebranding of his website into footballarchaeology.com with all the things that us lovers of football history like. Tim's up to talk about this and more coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with PigskinDispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pigpen, your portal to positive football history. And as every day, we like to dive back into some good football history. And what a better way to do it than to do it with friends. And we have a guest that we've had on before. Author Tim Brown is with us. It's not the legendary Hall of Fame football player Tim Brown. It is the legendary author and historian, archaeologist Tim Brown, who is a wealth of knowledge, and we're always excited to have him. Tim Brown, welcome back to the Pigpen.
Hey, Darren, thank you. At least I have more money than the other Tim Brown, so yeah, I'm good. I'm good with that.
Yeah, that's good. That's great if you got more money than him. I sure don't. That's for sure. So Tim, you have really got some exciting things going on. You've had some changes to your branding since the last time we talked to you. Maybe you'd like to share some of that, what you have going on.
Yeah, sure. So, anybody who follows my stuff would probably know this already, but I have been, I wrote a book now 5-6 years ago called Fields of Friendly Strife. And so I had created website to kind of promote that, and then to do some additional writing, cover things that I hadn't quite, there's things you have to cut out of a book. And so, things you can spin additional yarns on. But over time, I was writing less and less about that topic, and more in line with the book, which was how football became football. So, all kinds of nice about how football evolved and the story that went on with that. So, what I ended up doing was I also wanted to get off. I was on a WordPress platform, which provides a lot of flexibility, but it was great when I started because I didn't know where I was going to go with things. But it turned out most of them I'm writing and I'm, inserting pictures and things like that. So I didn't need a lot of flexibility. Didn't need a lot of functions that I was basically paying for and having the technical pain that goes along with that. So I've switched everything over to a platform called Substack. That's really a newsletter or platform, but all stores everything, so you can go on anytime and look at the archives of what's been written. And it makes it very easy. So it's much cleaner. And one of the things that's allowed me to do was everything that I wrote in the past was what I'd call long form. It's kind of an essay on the history of some particular topic. 5-10 minute read, that kind of thing. But Substack is so easy to work with that, I've now started these daily little modules, kind of bite-sized chunks. And I call them today's tidbit. And it's just, sometimes it's little portions of things that I've written about before, but other times there's all kinds of little things you find that don't warrant a whole article, but they're just kind of interesting tidbits. And so, each day, 7:00 Eastern, I post one of those out, and then I put it on Twitter as well, and that's good. And so, depending on how you digest information, you can find me on those 3 places.
Yeah, they're extremely interesting. I've subscribed to it, and it's great to get that little bit of, like you said, it's little jolts of football information. The one you had most recently, the night we were recording this, is on football cleats and sort of their history, and how football players back in yesteryear started wearing cleats and changing their cleats and going to the cobbler. It was fascinating. It was like a 20, 30-second read with a beautiful picture too. So really set the point across. So very well done on the tidbits.
Yeah, thank you. They're fun. I'm doing research on one thing or another, and I cross a little thing. It's like, oh, that could make a tin. And so I just make a note of it, and 2 days later, I just put it in the queue.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. It's great feed. Maybe you could share with our listeners if they want to subscribe to get the tidbits each day in their email, or follow you on social media so they get the tidbits. If you want to share your information right now, we can share it again at the end as well. Sure. So my site it's a Substack site, but it's www.footballarchaeology.com. And so just one string of characters, and you just have to make sure that you spell archaeology correctly, which is ARCHAEOLOGY. And then if you can find me on Twitter the same way. There's actually another Football Archaeology that's in the UK, but I'm the one where the two words are pushed together. And I think you can find me on Facebook searching Football Archaeology too. So, any one of those three is a way to get there. But if you want to make, if you like it and you want to make sure you don't miss an episode, just subscribe to Football Archaeology. You can do either a free subscription or paid. And then it'll show up and you'll get an email every day with that information. So, read it at your leisure, or just come and visit the site whenever it makes sense for you. Yeah, well, that's great information. I highly suggest that to the listeners, because it's a great bit of get your football brain filled with some more information to look at the history and preserve the history of football, which is what we do and what we enjoy. But I think it's a really interesting name that you chose to rebrand from the Fields of Friendly Strife to Football Archaeology, because that's really, in essence, that paints a great picture, really what you do. Starting with your book, how football became football, and what you've been doing lately on the Fields of Friendly Strife and now Football Archaeology site, because you really dive into it with some great investigation and pick up those little nuances of the game and how they came about, which is really fascinating how some of these things have evolved. And that's one particular thing that I really enjoy about the site. Yeah, I just thought, I just have always enjoyed kind of how systems develop. And so, it's very easy to go through, just look at the game today and just say, well, it's always been like this. Well, it hasn't. There's been lots and lots of changes. And there's kind of a neat, there's a neat concept. I won't get into it too far here, but in evolution, in the biological sense of evolution, there's an idea that, species can only evolve so far at one time, right? And, human systems like football, it's the same way. There's things that, like when they first started, when they legalized forward pass in 1906, people didn't know what to make of this thing. They basically passed it forward, just kind of like they passed, what we call handoff or a toss, they called it a pass at the time, the backwards pass. They pretty much did the same thing, two-handed pushes and things like that. They couldn't conceive, or most of them couldn't conceive of what we now think of as, downfield, overhand spiral passes. Just they didn't know how to do. They couldn't even imagine that. So it was more of like what we would call today like a shovel pass when you throw forward. Yeah, that kind of thing. And there's, I've got some stuff coming up. One of the blog articles that I'm writing right now is football or the forward pass in 1906, and so I've got some plays that people drew up and published in newspapers, and some of them were just it was like a sweep, student body right kind of thing, and whoever had the ball would, if he was about to be tackled, he just kind of push it a couple yards in front of one of his blockers, for them. So that's how they were conceiving of the forward. It was like a forward lateral, not a forward pass. They didn't have the word lateral yet, but that's the, so right. There's things like that. Well, from my officiating days, I had when I was a rookie official, and I was first getting on a crew. We had an old veteran referee on there, and anytime you said the word lateral, he would flip out. He goes, "There's no such thing as a lateral. Lateral is exactly sideways. That's the definition of lateral. It's either forward or backwards pass. I never call it a lateral." So every time I hear lateral, I still cringe because he frightened the bejeebies out of me, if you know what I mean. But
yeah.
But,
well, the lateral, the Yaleys were the ones called it a lateral. So blame them.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess we better address the elephant in the room, or maybe more appropriately, the tiger in the room. As the listeners can't see this, but Tim and I are via Zoom call and we can see each other. And Tim came on. He's got showed me a bottle of beer from Canada, and he's got a Hamilton Tiger Cats sweatshirt on. And I think we might be having a theme here of what Tim's came on to talk about tonight. So, Tim, I'm going to let you lead the way here, and something that's very timely and appropriate for this time of year.
Yeah. So first I have to put in a plug for Le Fin du Monde, the beer that I'm drinking. Some people like the Canadian maple syrup. I prefer their other liquid. So if Unibrew Brewery wants to, shoot me some money, or beer, I'll take it.
Yeah. You'll take the liquid payment, right?
Yeah. So, So the day that you release this, if all goes to plan, which is on Friday, the Canadian football preseason will start. And so, I guess I'm here to talk a little bit about Canadian football. And I'm not a huge, it's not like I know Canadian football inside or out. I have researched it more from a historical standpoint. But I've been to, half a dozen games. Over the years, I subscribed to TSN so that I can watch Canadian football as soon as it comes on in late May, early June, and I watch games through the season. And so, it's great football. It's fun, interesting game. It's football. It's just, some differences in the rules, right? And so, I've written, I think, 4 different articles now about Canadian football, mostly from an American perspective, right? What's different about the Canadian rules versus American? How did they evolve differently? Why don't they? And basically, it's kind of some of it's a theme of why do they mess with our great game, right? Why do those silly Canadians do this silly thing and have a wider field and only 3 downs? And so some of my writing is to try to explain, well, why did it evolve that way in Canada versus our great game, right? And at least half the time, the Americans are to blame. We're the ones who changed things. It wasn't the Canadians.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's comes up all the time. I have people coming on and like, why, just like you said, why do the Canadians take a good game and just, morph it into this? It's only part of the game. And but I'm not going to steal any of the thunder. This is a great topic to talk about. So I'll let you continue.
Yeah. So I mean, there's at its core, they're the same game, right? There's a reason why Canadian football is dominated by American quarterbacks. There's a reason why they're fighting right now in their contracts about how many Americans they can have play on the field, be on the field at any given time. And so the coaches, players transfer very readily between the two games because they're so similar. And yet there are some differences. And, I think there's a few differences, and I think Canadian game is a lot better than the American games, both for safety reasons and otherwise. So, I guess that one of the biggest things that, I think most of your audience probably is an American audience. One of the biggest things people need to understand about Canadian football is that, they both started from rugby, American football and Canadian rugby. I think people have a general sense, Americans have a general sense of how their game evolved. But the Canadian game stayed much truer to rugby for a lot longer. It remained pretty much of a rugby game. They adopted some portions of American football, pre-1903, but a lot of it was rugby-like. They did adopt the scrimmage fairly early on. So, the game paused and they had a snap. But just like American football, initially we snapped with the foot, not with the hands. The center or the snapper back, that they called it at the time, rolled the ball under his foot back to the quarterback, and then he had to toss it to somebody else and advance the ball, much like a rugby scrum. So, they kept doing that until 1921. We stopped doing that in like 1892. They started off with different size field and things like that. But then they got to a point where there was kind of a pressure to try to adopt some of the American game. And then there were others who were like, no, we don't want any of that, both because it's more dangerous and because it's American. They wanted to keep a Canadian game. So, but there was a guy named Burnside, and so they adopted the Burnside rules in 1903, which pretty much brought a lot of American football elements into Canadian rugby. And but then they pretty much dropped that after a couple of years. So there were parts of American football that stayed, parts of, and then other parts they were kind of returned to the Canadian rugby game.
Now, don't a lot of people up in Canada equate Burnside to almost like the Canadian Walter Camp? Don't they? I've heard that mentioned quite a few times.
Yeah, I think he was critical in the development of the game, and yet they also tossed out a lot of his rules. So, it's kind of a half and half.
Yeah, that's true.
Kind of.
The other thing I always found kind of interesting is because some of Walter Camp's ideas, he gets sometimes. I love big fan of Walter Camp and everything he did, but some of the things he did, I've had readings where I've seen where some of his he borrowed some ideas from McGill University when they came down and played Harvard in 1874, and I don't think he watched the game, but I'm sure by osmosis it got down to Yale. And so some of those ideas with the downs and some of that actually came from Canada. And, sometimes we get more credit than we deserve for, with Walter Camp of changing rugby into football, but a lot of it was Canadian first.
Yeah. I don't know that the Canadians influenced Camp from a downs perspective that early on. For sure, the McGill University Harvard game was really the reason why we opted for rugby. It was a chain of events, but that's what drove Americans to rugby rather than soccer, because they were basically playing soccer up until then. And the Princeton Rutgers game that everybody talks about, that was a soccer match. Round ball, kicking the ball, that kind of thing. It wasn't quite soccer, but it was just much closer to soccer than what most people would like to admit. But one of the places where Camp went up, there were a lot of changes made between 1905 and 1906, and during the season of 1905, Camp went up to Hamilton to watch a Hamilton Tigers game. They weren't, the Cats kind of merged with them later on, but and it was from, they had adopted, the Canadians adopted 3 downs for 10 yards, whereas American football was playing 3 downs for 5 yards at the time. And he liked that idea, tried to bring it down, and basically he couldn't get it through the committee. But then they did change it. Ultimately, they changed it in 1912. They adapted 3 downs for 10 yards in 1906, and then in 1912 they switched it to 4 downs for 10 yards. So, that's just an example of Burnside rules. The Canadians adopted what we were doing at the time, and then we're the ones that changed it to 4 downs, right? So they stuck with our rule, and we changed it. So the difference is, if you don't like the difference, it's because the Americans changed it.
And that was basically an effort to they're still trying to clean up the roughness of the game. We know the big change that happened in 1906, but it took some years to evolve away from that just brutal running game, which you eloquently quite well say in your book, How Football Became Football. So,
yeah, I think it was one of those things where, the Canadians the Canadians recognized that three downs for 10 yards would force, they had a wider field too, but that would force a more open game. You couldn't just pound the ball up the gut and expect to get 10 yards and 3 downs. So that made a lot of sense. But then the Americans, with few exceptions, basically once they switched to 3 downs, 10 yards, they just kept pounding up the gut, and so they weren't really making, the game was still, some of the terrible things were disposed of, but so that's when they went to four downs. And again, they couldn't figure out how to do the forward pass effectively, those kinds of things. So, it took a while for those changes and the openness to really open up.
Okay. Very interesting. So so the Canadians just kept that down. That's one of the big differences, I guess, between a CFL game and an NFL game, just those 3 downs and the urgency there is to try to get that line to game, which is the same distance in both leagues. But, there's a lot more urgency in the Canadians. So the passing game has always been more prevalent since the CFL came in the 1950s, where the NFL took a little longer to what we see today.
Yeah. And even in the Canadian football, the defensive line has to be 1 yard off the ball. Right. And so, when we introduced the neutral zone in 1906, and, they basically, I've never been able to figure out when the Canadians adopted the 1 yard off the ball. But, that's part of the fact that they only have, it's not as big a difference in their game because, they've only got 3 downs anyways. Right. But, if you're half a yard short, you're pretty much going to make it if you do a quarterback sneak.
Right. Yeah. You ought to get a yard or 2 out of every QB sneak. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But, that's just the way the game is. And, everybody follows those rules and it works out. It's just fine. But I think that's actually one where, from a safety standpoint, I've advocated in the past, that's something Americans should look at, because, so much of the pounding of the head that occurs for offensive and defensive linemen is a result of, our neutral zone being the length of the ball. You widen that thing out and there'll be, fewer head contacts, fewer, and less severe.
Yeah, and that 1 yard's really not enough distance for somebody to gain great momentum to, going back to the old flying wedges and everything like that. A yard, you're both trying to advance forward, both the offensive and defensive player. So you're really only meeting at a half yard, in a perfect world. So not as crushing as 20-yard head start at full speed.
Yeah, exactly.
So okay, so how about you alluded to it a little bit, the field size. The CFL is quite a bit different in dimensions from the American football fields. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, that's one where, I think from the start, they had a bigger field, meaning a wider field. And when they, obviously they have the thing that always, makes Americans freak out is maybe not so much the width of the field, but it's the 55-yard line and then the end zones, right? So, and people either just don't know or they forget that the American field had a 55-yard line until 1912. Or I'm sorry, 1912. So, and in fact, one of the tidbits that I did maybe a month ago was a picture at University of Michigan Notre Dame game, and it's a poor quality picture, but it's the only one I could find. It's at the yard marker, 55, sitting on the sideline. But, the American field had a 55-yard line, or it was also called midfield line. But, and then until 1912, we didn't have an end zone. We had an area called, in goal, but there was no end line. So, if a ball got punted, 20 yards past the goal line, well, that's just somebody had to go get it. It's still in play. And so, but when they wanted, there was a rule in place where you couldn't throw a forward pass. If the forward pass went over the goal line, whether it bounced or flew, that was a touchback. And they wanted to eliminate that rule, but they didn't want to give the team, they didn't want them to be able to run 40 yards deep into the end zone for a pass. So they put the end line in, and then they defined the end zone, which then made our field, instead of 110 yards of defined territory, that made it 130 yards of defined territory, because now you had two defined 10-yard end zones. And it simply wouldn't fit in certain stadiums like the Polo Grounds. So they kept the end zones 10 yards in length, but they got rid of the 55-yard line. So we ended up with a 100-yard field plus two 10-yard end zones. So again, this is one the Canadians maybe kind of copied us, back in 1903 with the Burnside rules. But we're the ones who changed and got rid of the 55-yard line, not them.
Yeah, so because of those concrete stadiums that they were building right at that time, they were sort of trapped into that size. And Harvard didn't want to rip down half their stadium and rebuild it, I'm sure, after it was only a couple of years.
Yeah, well, that's the width portion of it. When Harvard, when they first built Harvard Stadium, it was a U shape. It wasn't enclosed. And I think they then eventually enclosed it, or had some temporary stands in the one end. But the if you look at pictures, it's right up there. It's like Kinnick Stadium in Iowa. The stands are right there on top of the field. And so there was suggestions in 1905 to expand the width of the American football field, but Harvard had just built Harvard Stadium in 1903, and they're like, sorry, we're not changing. And it was among the first reinforced concrete buildings in the world, and they were like, no, we're not moving this thing.
And Harvard at the time is one of the big three of football anywhere, with Yale and Princeton. So they have quite influential at that time.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's one of those things, like just the artifact of having built that stadium. If it had been a wooden stadium like everybody else's at the time, not a big deal. We can move it. But, once it's in concrete, it's in concrete.
Yeah, that's for sure. I got a great opportunity probably almost 10 years ago now to get, I had a relative that was on the Yale staff, and I got a chance, it was during the off season, it was in summertime. I got a chance to get a tour of Yale Stadium. And, I know Yale was built a few years after Harvard's, but I can't even imagine, it's basically dug into the ground and then cemented all the way around, in a big oval, as the way it is today. And I imagine that was probably a lot of its original, the design. It's it'd be a massive task to try to make that field any wider or longer than it already is.
Yeah. It's I saw the Harvard Yale game at Harvard one time, and I've been to Yale for other reasons, but cool old stadiums. They're from a different time.
Definitely are. I think one of the biggest things was the outside of it. I'm looking for a stadium. I don't really think they had lights maybe they did. I can't remember if they had light poles, but the thing I'm looking for these giant grandstands, from the outside, and really the wall's probably only maybe 20 foot tall off of ground level. And then when you walk in, it's dug into the ground, which is kind of unique.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of stadiums were like that back then. Rose Bowl was built in a similar way. They try to find some kind of canyon or something, they didn't have the same kind of earth moving equipment and excavation equipment that we have now. And so if you could find a natural hillside, you used it.
Yeah. Oh, right.
So
Put the seats there. You got your amphitheater all built, just like the Romans.
I mean, I think Camp Randall, I'm a Wisconsin fan. Camp Randall has some of the same kinds of things. The big house at Michigan, I mean, that's an impressive structure, but it's a lot of that is underground, so not unusual.
Okay. All right. So we got the field size. We got the three downs covered, some of the history of that. What are some of the other differences between what we deem as American football and Canadian football?
I mean, you've got the goalpost location, would be one. So, American football started out with the goalposts on the right on the goal line, or sitting 2 yards back, and then the crossbar and the poster over the goal line. College football moved it in 1927, moved it to the end line, and the NFL did at that time as well because they followed the college rules. And then when they created their own rule book in 1933, they then moved it back to the goal line. And then once we had soccer style kickers who were too accurate, then they said, "Oh, we better move those things back and it'll make it at least 10 yards more difficult." And so then, they've sat there ever since. But in the Canadian game, it's been on the goal line all along. And I think for them, part of it is just they've always had a longer or deeper end zone. And so there's more flexibility. It's not quite as compact. They don't have as many plays right down there on the goal line where potentially, you're going to run over the goalposts and those kinds of things. Passing is just a bigger option, as well as sweeps. You've got that much more flexibility in your play calling. So I think they've just never needed to relocate it. So, but there's that, and, then going even further back, that I think one of them, the men in motion. I mean, here's another place where the goofy Americans changed stuff on them. So like American football, because it was rugby, there was no rule that said people couldn't be moving, when the ball was snapped or, the scrimmage or scrummage was going on. And so, and it stayed that way for quite a while. And then eventually, the Americans said, okay, 1893, I think it was, they said only 3 men in motion, still allowing them to go forward if they wanted to. And then, there was kind of a succession of changes, largely because of this mass play and momentum plays, all the run it up the gut. Teams that send 3 guys right through the same hole and they didn't have a rule on 7 men on the line of scrimmage. So they'd have like 3 guys on the line of scrimmage and 2 guards back. And, they'd just be sending guys through a hole. And that's where a lot of the danger came from. So the, requiring 7 men to be on the line of scrimmage, and then the reducing to only 1 man in motion, and he had to be either going parallel to or away from the line of scrimmage. That was all safety related. So, whereas in Canadian, it was still Canadian rugby at the time, their game, they didn't allow blocking, what they called interference, but they didn't allow blocking until 1921. Okay, so that tells you something about the rugby nature of the game, because rugby doesn't allow blocking, right? And so, because that man is offside, he's in front of the man with the ball. So, because we kind of solved the mass and momentum thing by restricting men in motion. They never had they never had the mass momentum thing going on. So it was just fine to, they didn't allow blocking at the time we were having the momentum issues, right? So, we kind of solved that problem. We kept the momentum, or we kept the blocking and eliminated motion, whereas they ultimately added blocking first, just within the first 4 yards from scrimmage, things like that. So it was things evolving at different times, kind of somewhat parallel paths, but, they lagged behind us in terms of allowing blocking. And then, from that point on, once they kind of allowed blocking, then things started edging more and more towards the American game. The forward pass was first allowed in the late 20s out in like Western Canada. The Western Canada and Eastern Canada have always had different views of the game, which kind of reinforces the East-West, nature of the CFL, which is fun. And even, the college leagues as well. And then, the forward pass was legalized all over Canada in 1931. So again, very much of a rugby style game until the 20s, 30s, and then from that point on, especially once they started importing American players and American coaches, then all of a sudden, the Americanization of the game becomes, a bigger factor.
Yeah, I always kind of found that interesting. What you say, how the forward pass sort of came, a decade and a half earlier, was developed in the American game that wasn't the Canadian game, especially, when they are embracing those three downs. They're, like you're saying, they're not blocking for some time during that. And you would almost think that that forward pass would have been, hey, here's our answer. This is a great gift here, and that they would have embraced it, sooner than we would have in America. And I just kind of find that always a little bit odd.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, why it all happened. I think some of it, and even like the difference in the Western teams versus Eastern, if you were a Canadian team out West, and again, it was all amateur, Canadian football was the Grey Cup and everything. That was all amateur till, late 50s, maybe. They had some paid players. It was more like semi-pro in many respects. But, teams would have like some guys who were getting paid some good money, and then other guys who, were virtually, playing for free or whatever. But, the teams out West are just more isolated, And so some of them just had to find teams to play, and they played American teams, And so I think they just, whereas, things are just like in the US, geographically, things are tighter. There's more population in the East. And so they had more folks that they could play. And even though their leagues would have like only 4 teams, you'd think they'd get bored out of their minds playing the same people over and over again. But, so they were able to kind of stick to their game. And, they love the game. There's people all over the world love rugby still,
Right.
They just kind of, made a slower transition from rugby to, gridiron. So,
Okay.
not good or bad. It's just different.
Right. It's just an interesting thing. I always find kind of interesting on there. Now, speaking of interesting, there's this an extra scoring, I guess, play or event that happens in Canadian football over what we recognize in American football. Maybe you could explain that to us a little bit.
Yeah. So I think now it's officially just called the single, but the single or the rouge. It's, they have always had, or they still have, a couple of elements that are, harken back to the rugby days, right? So the kicking, punting game is a bigger part of Canadian football than American football. Even as important as it is, in the US. So there's, so I'll get to each of these, but we've got the onside punt, the return kick, and then the single or the rouge. And so, in the Canadian game, if you kick or punt the ball into the opponent's end zone, they have to get it out of the end zone. And if they don't, then you get a point, right? So it's very much of a field position, thinking game, which, is what rugby and everything was in American football early on. So it still holds that field position oriented thinking. One of the things that a somebody who's in the end zone can do, and they can do it anywhere on the field. If you catch a punt, you can punt it right back, right? That's called a return kick. And you could do that in the NCAA until 1963. People stopped doing it kind of in the 20s, but it was still legal until 63. So, every once in a while you're reading an article and you see somebody, you see mention of a return kick. And, it's, again, under a field position game, if you didn't have much of an offense and you had a pretty good defense, the best thing you could do is catch the punt it right back to him right now. Not, now. And you could do it on an interception. You could do it on any change of possession. You could return kick. So, that's still part of the Canadian game. So every once in a while, you'll see a clip come over on, Twitter or whatever of an exchange in a Canadian game. A lot of times when somebody gets the ball in the end zone and they, boom, kick it right back. And then they catch it and they kick it right back. And so sometimes it goes on, 2 or 3 kicks, and it's just a fascinating thing because Americans look at it and go, oh, this is bizarre. What are they doing here?
Some of them are going, this is blasphemy. You have the ball. Why are you giving it back?
Yeah. Well, once offenses got advanced enough that, you could be pretty confident you could move the ball, then it made no sense to do the return kick, right? Unless, there were certain circumstances, like it's a tie game, and if I don't get the ball out of this end zone, I'm going to give the other team a point, right? So, but we don't face that in America. But another one is the onside kick. So, in American thing, an onside kick is a kickoff that, has to travel 10 yards and then either team can pick it up. But, again, hearkening back to the rugby days, there's an element of American football where we had what was called a quarterback kick oftentimes, but also an onside kick. And there were kind of 2 different versions of it that existed at different times. But long and short of it, the quarterback kick was around from the beginning of the game until 1922, I think it was. But basically the quarterback would get the snap, in a normal T formation, so 3 backs behind the quarterback. He'd get the snap and he'd punt it. And a lot of times he tried to punt it kind of at an angle. And then anybody who was so anybody who was onside, meaning behind the guy with the ball, behind the quarterback who was punting the ball, they could run down there and recover the ball, just like on our kick off onside kick. And then one of the rule changes in 1906 was they made everyone eligible to recover the ball. And they thought, there was a big contention. There were a lot of people, Pop Warner thought that was going to be a more important change than the forward pass, right? And, a lot of other people thought the same thing, but, it didn't work out that way. But, so anyways, this onside kick is still part of the Canadian game, right? So if you, you punt it and one of your guys can go down there, the punting team can recover the ball and maintain possession of it. So, it's one of those, it's a nod to the rugby origins of their game.
I'm sure it makes an already exciting punt play that much more exciting. That's for sure. That's the ones as us as officials, the kicking game. That's where all the wild stuff happens. That's where officials have to have a head on a swivel. Scrimmage plays is one thing. Where the guys are starting. You might not know which way they're going, but where they're starting from, and pretty much the flow. But the kicking game, almost anything can happen when you have a loose ball. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and they also, the punter or the punt receiver they don't allow the fair catch in Canadian football. But the gunners or, anybody coming down on the punting team who's covering the punt, they have to stay, 5 yards away from the guy receiving the punt. So, it adds that exciting element to the game. They're forced to catch the ball. but they're not going to get slammed. They're not going to have somebody running full speed.
So they're operating almost like the NCAA had the 5-yard bubble. They have the bubble on the punt receiver then, rather than have the interference. Or I'm sorry, with that, I mean the fair catch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So it's same kind of notion, but so again, it makes the, if you're gonna, obviously they're gonna punt a lot more in their game with only 3 downs, and so that allows the excitement to remain, because the punt return can be a really exciting play in football, as can the kick return, but they can also be very dangerous plays. So
yeah, it seems the more the NFL rules are evolving, they're trying to eliminate the free kick, the kickoff returns. Moving the kickers up and letting them kick in the end zone more often, so you have more touchbacks. There's been talks every year in the NFL about totally eliminating the free kick, and the punting game is it's wide open.
Yeah, I think kickoff returns can be such exciting plays, but I advocate for getting rid of them. Amos Alonzo Stagg said get rid of them back in like 1905. So there's a pretty good history of people who recognize it's a dangerous play. Very high percentage of injuries occur on kickoff. Relative to the all other plays, kickoff returns are horrible. From a injury standpoint. Get rid of them. But,
yeah. Yeah. Well, we might have to have another conversation one of these days on suggestions on what to do with that play. That might be an interesting topic someday. So I think part of the thing too is just I did want to just add one other point. Sure.
On the single. So I've just come across this fairly recently, but at the real early stages of American football, they were calling, writers used to refer to, quote, the extra point as a single. It wasn't really it wasn't a single point at the time, but they still called it. I think they were adopting some of the Canadian language, but the single, it was the first point scored in a Canadian national championship game before the Grey Cup was a single. So,
really?
So it's been a part of their game for a long time.
Well, Tim, we really appreciate you coming on here and talking about, these differences in the CFL and the NFL, or the Canadian game and the average American game. I guess this transfers to all levels, high school up through the pros, both in Canada and America. We know the rules are different from high school, college, and the NFL here in the States, but basically the same game. Where the CFL, I think they use pretty much the same rule book at their different levels of football up there. I think it's all the same there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I can't even tell you that. Football Canada is their governing body for amateur football. I think it's the same. I think I don't even know that. I
think, well, at least let me put it this way: their high school game and college game and pro game are more similar to each other than ours are. I guess maybe that's maybe a fair statement to say.
Yeah. So I guess for me, I just if this podcast gets a couple of people to pay attention, watch a couple of Canadian games. It's a fun game. It's a very exciting game, and it's excellent football. I mean, in terms of a lot of players and everything. The fans love it. I mean, just like, it's maybe, I guess I can compare Canadian football fans are kind of like hockey fans in the US, it's a little bit niche-y, there's a lot of Canadians who, love the NFL too, but so it's a little bit niche-y, but, they love being in that niche, they're loyal, good fans, and it's a fun game. It's just, and I turn on games, I'm reading or I'm doing research, whatever I'm doing, and I've got it on in the background and pop my head up to watch the return kick or two.
Right.
Hope that it comes up.
Right.
See one live.
And the other thing is it's consistent other than a COVID year. It's consistent of, basically 2 months of meaningful football before the college and the NFL seasons kick off here.
Yeah.
So that's the best time, watching them, sweat it out in the hot summer days. And, when we don't have anything else really going on here. So that's
And I just, for me, the atmosphere feels a bit more like the U.S. college game, which I prefer over the NFL, but that's, again, to each their own. But it's a fun game, and definitely worth a watch. So just encourage people to watch.
Yeah, and I know last year they ran them on ESPN Plus for those that don't live near the border like we do, that we can pull in some Canadian stations or buy a TSN package or anything. But ESPN Plus, I know, had some games last year, and I think they plan on covering some this year too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and the ESPN Plus is just the TSN package.
Is that what it is? Okay.
Yeah, so I subscribe to that for there's a college basketball team or two that I watch that way as well, but that's it's one of my subscriptions.
Yeah, okay.
It gets me a good number of the CFL games.
Okay. Well, speaking of subscriptions, that's a good segue. Why don't you tell us again about where people can go to your site and opt to one of your multiple subscription plans that you have there, and also give us your social media again.
Yeah. So my site is www.footballarchaeology.com. And you can find me under the same name on Twitter and on Facebook. Again, basically everything I post on Football Archaeology, I kind of double post or triple post, to the other two. But the value of the subscribing is, you will get if you're, depending on how many people you follow on Twitter, any single feed can get buried in all the other stuff. So if you subscribe, you'll get the email with the contents of each post. And it's free. Now I am going to be, there's also paid subscriptions that serve two purposes. One is it basically pays me money what it does mostly is it funds, like, it costs me money to buy images and acquire licenses and those kinds of things. And so, it basically subsidizes that a bit. But I will be adding content that only paid subscribers will get. And right now it's probably going to be two things. I'm going to start a podcast competing with you.
It's never a competition when you're doing the same job of preserving football history. So that's the way I look at it.
Yeah. But at least initially, a lot of what I'm going to do on the podcast is basically contents of what will be my third book, but I'm probably going to serialize the book on my website first. So this third book, I have a title already, but I'll just call it Football Words, but that's not the real title. But essentially, it's just looking at how football terminology developed and what was happening in football at the time that required new terms. So, like, when did weak side and strong side come in? What was happening in football at the time that terms like that emerged? That's just one example. Middle linebacker, outside linebacker. What was happening in football then that required new terms? It's going to be kind of little more along the lines of like my today's tidbits, just quick hitting 1 or 2 page, 3 page little notes. So bite-sized chunks,
little nuggets from the book.
Yeah. So instead of, my current books are things, you got to sit down and read a 350 page book. This one could be a bathroom reader. You can read it from start at the beginning and end at the end if you want, or you can just, put it wherever it is that you have an extra moment or two and, just want to be able to pick something up, flip to a page and read. And so it could serve that purpose as well.
Yeah. But please, listeners, don't do it while you're driving or something dangerous like that, especially if I'm following you. We don't do that.
No, don't do either of the two things I suggested.
That message is for you, lady that puts on her makeup, puts in front of me every morning. That's a message for you. So, well, Tim, we thank you again for coming on and sharing some of your knowledge and your research and enlightening us about another element of the game of football, whether it's Canadian or American or wherever it's played. The gridiron game is loved, and we appreciate you coming on here and sharing it.
Well, always fun, always a good time, and you've got my email and my phone number, so whenever I'm more than happy to come on and chat.
We're taking a peek over at the chains and the down marker. It's 4th and long. We're going to have to punt the ball and get on out of here, but we'll have another series tomorrow for your football history headlines, so be sure to tune in. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast. PigskinDispatch.com is a proud affiliate of the Sports History Network, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.
Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandham at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.